People with a secular mentality who are involved in political movements often look down at religious-minded people, even within the same movement, thinking that they, the religious, are deficient in that they lack the clear, rational system of explanation that allows the secularist to coherently analyze the situation and then prescribe proper policy. But if you want to take a pragmatic approach, it would probably serve you best to emulate those systems that have worked in the past. And by far, the most successful political systems in history have used religion. Mohammedanism would not have spread if they attempted to, or if Muhammad attempted to, using reason alone, analyze what's best for society and then put forward his propositions. Religion is a vital tool. And if you look at the expansion of the Arab tribes, they were a minority, even in the Middle East. And today they have descendants all over North Africa and eastward into India. And further than that as well. So Muhammad, doing his religious thing, achieved far more than he could have if he had attempted to be exclusively rationalistic. Let alone the fact that most of the advanced systems of rationalism, in the philosophical sense, have emerged out of theistic or deist traditions. So, metaphysics is not only necessary for justifying ultimately your political beliefs and having a coherent worldview, but it's also useful. So, I'm going to start a series on the metaphysics of the perennial philosophy. I'm a perennialist. I'm also a Catholic, but I don't think I'm the only traditionalist Catholic, not with the lowercase t, but the uppercase t. And I interpret the Catholic myths according to the philosophical system that I'll attempt to outline. But we'll start with metaphysics. You could always start with epistemology or somewhere. It's hard to arrive at what's the proper first philosophy. But for me, I think the philosophical instinct is visible for the first time when the child questions things like, in a vague sense, the meaning of life, or why there's anything at all. Whether space and time are limited. I remember laying in my bed at night thinking about the prospect of infinite space and just not being able to reconcile that with my own imagination, then trying to think of finite space, and that's even more contradictory. You can't imagine a finite border to space. You can't imagine an end to space. So those questions are the kind of questions to begin with, and after a lot of thought from, when I was 7 or 8 thinking about that, I've come down to the question, which I've articulated before as the central pivot of a number of arguments, but the question is the universe infinite? Now, a prior question to that would be questioning the validity of the concept. Which way? I want to go over here. Universe. We will equivocate between universe and reality. And in that, there's an implied transcendent unity. The inherent unity between opposites. In perception, this is present as the ego. But in information systems generally, for all of these components, say there's only three things in the universe, three things in reality, A, B, C. In order for us to recognize that there is A, B, C, we're positing that there's another factor, D, that's shared in common amongst A, B, and C. So there's an inherent unity in any opposition. Chris Langan, in his cognitive theoretic model of the universe, calls this syndifionosis, or some ridiculous term, but it's not original to Chris Langan. This is something that goes back to antiquity. So the notion of a universe is the notion that any collection of things, as long as they can be articulated, as long as we can recognize them, have some kind of intrinsic unity. Nothing in the universe is actually separate. Then, moving further on this tact, how can we be sure then that everything that we experience, the realm of possible interaction, so let's say that this is us as an identity at the center of a universe which is capable of interacting with us. That doesn't have to be strictly causal interaction, but any way of making an impact, whether that's through a force of superordination, that is the existence of Platonic realities, forms, or laws, like an arta or a mot or something like that, a logos, that can influence us, and that's something that's interacting with us, although not necessarily in a causal sense. So there's the identity of the observer and then the things that are capable of affecting it. Now, outside of the things that are capable of affecting it, are we to talk of separate universes altogether? Well, if those separate universes operate according to altogether different laws, if they share no law in common, then I guess it would make sense to talk of a separate universe. But as you notice, in hypothesizing the existence of separate, causally disconnected, etiologically isolated universes, we're also going to run into this whole D issue. So the structure of things is such that we can't talk about anything outside of the universe or the set of entities, whether they be metaphysical structures or physical structures or intentional structures, volitional structures. Anything incorporated in that is subject to this kind of transcendent unity or transcendental unity of opposition. So that's why we can talk about a universe in a coherent sense. But we are finite creatures with limited capacity for reasoning. And there's always the possibility that it is the case that there are things that are completely separate from anything that could conceivably interact with us and that we'll never know about it, but that nevertheless it is out there. Now, even when I say it's out there, that presupposes position, that presupposes properties, and we exist in a universe where there are properties and there are positions and systems of interaction, sets of things. So if any of those properties are shared in common with what's beyond the universe altogether, we can't conceive of it at all. Which, this is a good place. So we can't rationally discuss this, but there is kind of this chaos in the back of our mind. And that is part of the perennial systems. That's part of ancient mythology all over the world. In Norse mythology, the world emerges from chaos. In Greek mythology, in some versions, the world emerges from chaos beyond law. So it's not this Abrahamic, Semitic conception of someone, and this conception is also kind of present in the Hindu version as well, of the creation story. There are many, Hinduism is not one religion, it's a number of traditions linked by and large by the Vedas, but there's all sorts of different philosophical schools that have contradictory beliefs about things. One of the narratives is the being, reality being spoken into being, and it's the same in the Abrahamic system as well. That is different from the Greek system, where the apeiron, or the flux, the undifferentiated chaos, something happens within it. A cleft in chaos, Gununga gap in the Norse system, is opened, and antithetical elements, heat and the cold, or strife and love, are brought into interaction. So, on that note, I have this question. I was trying to write out my system of philosophy, and then I realized, I can't do this. I require the spoken word to be able to work these things out. But one of those things that I realized when I was dealing with this was there's a problem in the concept of infinite. There's a problem in the concept of the infinite. If by finite we mean any kind of limitation whatsoever, then we can't say that the number line is infinite, because it is, although it is unending in its, what's the word for it? It's ordinally infinite. It's infinite within the dimension that it has to operate with, the natural numbers. It's still finite insofar as, you're not going to have a pig. A pig is not one of the numbers. So you don't have the pig, therefore it's not infinite. Because there's a limitation in that the numbers don't include pigs. The numbers don't include a lot of things. So if we're really talking about a completely unlimited reality, when we're discussing the term, we're saying, does this apply to the universe? And if it does apply, there's all sorts of contradictions that we're going to run into immediately. One of them, now you can have qualified infinite universes, spatially infinite, temporally infinite, infinite in terms of informational complexity, but there are some things that just don't work. Like the infinite system, supposing it is, let's posit it, then can it be finite? No, clearly that violates the law of identity. But then you're saying, well, the infinite is limited to the metalogical laws. So, keep on doing this. Finite. If we have an infinite, we have something that cannot be a finite. And that's, say the infinite, or finite is A, infinite is not A. The metalogical law says that A is not equal to not A, and that one of them, and that's the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction is this. Law of identity is A equals A, and then the excluded middle is A is either A or not A. So that's why I feel comfortable, and I have in the past, saying things like the universe must either be infinite or finite. And I thought that was very meaningful. And it kind of is. There's some ground that you can cover with that. But as we can see, there's some sort of tension or antinomy inherent in the question. And this is really just a variant of the problem of omnipotence. Can God create a boulder so large he can't lift it? That's saying, is the omnipotent force capable of rendering itself not omnipotent? Can omnipotence negate its identity? Or is it restricted by its identity and therefore not fully omnipotent because it can't overcome that identity? I've never seen an adequate solution to the problem of omnipotence. I think it is one of the most powerful arguments that the atheist has. Now, people will argue things like omnipotence means things that are possible. Like, you can do all things that are possible, and God creates the system of what's possible. But that seems like kind of word salad. It's not getting around the fact that God, and this also gets into nominalism and realism. Like, if God's laying down the laws of possibility, can he violate them? In which case, the possible is completely, so if you posit that only possible things are within God's ability, and he can't contradict his own identity, then you're just pushing the problem of omnipotence back onto the universals that are instantiated with those forms of possibility. Because then, can God violate them? Can God render a triangle non-possible? So what we run into then is, if you want to say that reality is subject to the metalogical laws, then we can't really talk about the infinite in a coherent sense, not about an absolute infinity. But if we say that reality is not necessarily limited to the four metalogical laws, maybe we just can't think of the nature of reality because we're the kind of thing that is not able to do that. And it's very possible, which would mean if reality is infinite and this infinite thing is here, a lot of it is chaos, or I guess infinitely much of it is chaos that we can't comprehend, and then we have that kind of, classical universe of comprehensible entities at the center, with us at the very center. And the fact that we observe metalogical consistency and consistency in physical constants and things is completely derived from the anthropic principle. So we observe that A equals A only because we're the kind of thing whose cognition depends on A equals A. So there might be other forms of cognition or other forms of experience or other systems that are non-cognitive that don't observe A equals A. We can't conceive of them, and so to us they're chaos. But, you can't negate the possibility, because in order to negate the possibility, you'd be employing reason, which employs the four metalogical laws, and so you'd be therefore begging the question. So we really can't think outside of this. There's a limit to our thought. And I think perennialist systems do reflect that. When they talk about divinity or the undifferentiated, it is completely different, radically different than anything that we can conceive. You can't look into the face of God or you die. And the sannyasi in India, the ascetic, going into the deep state of meditation, achieving samsara, or wait, am I mixing up my terms? Yeah, I can't remember the term for the bliss state that they talk about. But hypothetically, you achieve a state where duality is eliminated and no logical structure applies, no description. Things are completely different and unbounded, fundamentally infinite. And that also explains partly why they say as you approach that state, you gain powers to transcend the physical laws. And I kind of hold that in the back of my mind as a possibility. Once I elaborate this system, you'll see why. But I don't know how much I want to do today on this. So if that's the case, you can explain completely coherently the existence of the metalogical laws, the existence of physical laws, any structure that we observe, we can explain from chaos and unbounded infinite, absolutely unbounded infinite, chaos and the anthropic principle. Because that chaos is not unbounded if it excludes the kind of being that we are. It can't exclude anything, or else it is bounded. Or else it's not chaos because there's some law, some binding force, some delimiting force acting upon it. So what is the origin then? Now, obviously, when we're discussing the chaos in this context, we're contradicting ourselves because we're treating it as if it's an identity and talking about it. But it's not the kind of thing that you can do that with and be consistent. But, that's why the everlasting Tao is not the Tao which can be named. You can't talk about this level of things. But it is seemingly the ultimate level. In any possible universe, in any possible mind, can anything beyond this as the fundamental limit of being be conceived? It's not clear that it could. So what is the origin of the metalogical laws, the anthropic principle? Perhaps, but it's just strange then that out of chaos, simultaneously a hierarchy seems to exist. And that hierarchy is very difficult to reconcile with the chaos. And so there's an inherent tension at a fundamental ontological level. And that is that at the peak of this pyramid of being is the undifferentiated. This is undifferentiated in that the chaos and toto is undifferentiated because there's no law delimiting it. Now, in systems, there is an undifferentiated bit at the bottom. There's no coherent system. There's no meaning unless you have discrete elements composing the complex structure. So as we analyze any complex structure, eventually you get down to something that is unanalyzable and simple. And as long as it's complex, you just continue the process of analysis. From our perspective, even perception, there's a limit to the fidelity of your sight. There's a limit to the fidelity of your notion of time. There's an atomic quality or a quantum quality to any system, even in theory. Again, this is something we're restricted to the way that our minds think here, but we can't think beyond the existence of a quantum nature to the most fundamental elements of any system observed by any observer. It seems to be a property of observation that in order to have a differentiated image, that image must be composed of pixels, in a sense, metaphorically. But the ontological hierarchy doesn't end there because there are different ways that undifferentiated can act. It can be on or off. I don't know if you can really see that. Yeah, I guess you can. Okay. So it can be on or off, and then using Gnostic thinking, Neoplatonic systems, there are different ways you can spin out the hierarchy of being. But it's clear that once you have the undifferentiated and then its action in a binary fashion, and even Chris Langen's system ultimately reduces down to something like this, expansion and contraction, love and strife, like a qualified monism, where a dual aspect monism is very prominent in perennialist systems, and even in, I don't know about classical theism exactly, probably not exactly. But then again, there is, because there's world and God, and that's a fundamental distinction that can't be eliminated. I don't think classical theism is a coherent system. I think it just is comprehensive enough that it doesn't leave room for most people to question it because their minds aren't big enough to question it. No offense to anyone who's a classical theist, but I think there are fundamental ontological questions that you have to just say, it's this way. And so why couldn't God create other systems of laws or other things out there? And they just have to say he didn't decide to. So classical theism resorts to appealing to God just felt like doing it this way, which is unsatisfactory to say the least if you're actually looking for a comprehensive explanation of things. If you're a philosopher and continue looking for wisdom, whether or not someone tells you something that is consistent with your sentiments or intellectual predilections. So this continues the ontological hierarchy until you get to, different types of forms. I'm going to use geometric shapes just to represent it that way. And Plato's forms are composed of yet simpler forms, and even the undifferentiated, as far as it interacts in a system, is a form of sorts. It's a type, it's a universal, and it's ambivalent functions are likewise forms, and that gets down into geometric properties, gets down into ultimately organic things like lizards and fish and different species. There are types of these entities because there are ways in which very basic properties combine in order to make all of these types. And the types are inherent in that ontological hierarchy. And all of this is, we'll call this logos, with the inherent law that is one in being with the Father, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. That's because he's not made. The undifferentiated spills into this in light of its own being and its nature as chaos at a certain level of interpretation. You can say that this is ultimately chaotic, or you can equally say that it is the culmination of this, because this culminates in all possible systems and hypothetically covers everything in here. It seems that way, but here comes the antinomy again, because there's always the possibility that there is more out there than what unfolds from the possible combinations of the undifferentiated with itself and dynamics of any possible information system. Like there is an intrinsic law that spills out naturally, that it existed from the beginning, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was with the Godhead, who was in the Abrahamic system over the face of the deep. And I think there's something like this underlying the concept of the deep. And it's interesting that God wasn't just there, he was there with the deep. And what is the deep? Is that what we're made of? Are we made of this chaos substance? And is God really like the theos that is distinct from the chaos? You can make one of two choices. You can go dualism and say that the Logos and God have different hypostases and different properties intrinsically, and they're eternal, but they sit against a more fundamental, seemingly, but not more fundamental, just like codependent or something, another aspect of being which is not divine. That there's fundamentally divine reality which is ordered, and then not divine reality. So then there's a Gnostic system of pleroma and kenoma, that which is within this divine hierarchy, the angelic worlds, and then there's the kenomic reality, which is being drawn by the will. And if you don't know this, in the Gnostic systems, Christ goes to save his counterpart. The Gnostic system of emanations maintain that there are levels of reality emanating from the undifferentiated in syzygies, or married couples, one feminine and one masculine. The last of these in the Valentinian Gnostic system is Christ and Sophia, and Sophia kind of gets seduced by the darkness out there in the kenoma, and wants to search out what's there, and that's wisdom, Sophia. And so love of wisdom on the part of Christ, or the Logos, or reason, love of wisdom is pursuing that divine philosopher, Christ, into the kenoma, into the darkness, into the depths of hell, ultimately, and drawing her back. And in doing that, the reality expands, and this process is infinite. Which is all nice and poetic, and maybe is useful in a religious context, and hits someone in a way that more dry and like really just analytical thinking gets you. There's value in it, but it's not really addressing the question of the seeming contradiction here. When I talk about the unlimited, I'm talking about something that can't be limited by an intrinsic logos, or else it's limited. There's also the possibility that we're just, like there's an error in our conception of a limitation or law. Like there's some fundamental error in that concept, which we would have to use some kind of dialectic to get down into the meaning of it. We'll bring out the Socratic method and talk about what is law, what is a limit, and all of that. But that's where I think I'm going to leave you at this point. And I will respond to any comment that legitimately addresses what I'm talking about. And I will include it in my next video if it's something that I need to include or something that I think is valuable for forwarding this discourse. So, metaphysics of the perennial philosophy, we've gotten down to a fundamental contradiction, which you can just leave it at that and say that these things are conceptually incommensurable, but nevertheless, that is the nature of them. That our minds can't reconcile the dual aspect, which is really one, of a God which is fundamentally generative and destructive. The logos is the destructive element. That's the masculine. The masculine is destructive, the feminine is creative. And the feminine is unlimited, it's chaotic, it's chthonic. The masculine is ordered, and so is a marriage of these fundamental metaphysical concepts possible? Thank you for listening.